Okay, good afternoon everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing and chairing this session on inclusion and co-design. So it's my honour to introduce our colleagues Lynn Grayson, Karen Bunning and Melanie Creer to the session. We're going to set straight away with Lynn's presentation. If you want to pop any questions you would like to raise in the chat, we'll into the Q&A, we will address those in the Q&A session at 10 to 4, and I'll keep an eye on that. So Lynn, over to you for your session and to give the participants a little bit more of an introduction to yourself.
Great, thanks very much. I'm hopefully going to be able to share my screen. And if people can just let me know whether they can see it. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Phew, that's the first bit to get over and done with. So thanks very much, everyone. So my name is Lynn Grayson, and I'm a speech and language therapist working with NHS Lanarkshire's Community Brain Injury team. I'm also doing my PhD part-time with Glasgow Caledonian University's Nursing, Midwifery and Allied Health Professions Research Unit. And my fantastic supervisors are Professor Marion Brady, Professor Leanne Toer and Dr. Maizoon Ali. So my talk today is about our work co-designing a new family project-based intervention with people who have lived experience of brain injury. I thought I'd start with a bit of background about why we chose to use co-design in our study. From my clinical experience and also from the literature search that I completed, I found that communication changes following traumatic brain injury have a profound and very long-lasting effect on both the person with brain injury, but also their family members. Part 1 and 2 of my PhD explored family perception of communication needs following brain injury, firstly through an international survey and then using a qualitative focus group. And we found that families are reporting very high levels of unmet need for managing communication changes after TBI. And this unmet need doesn't really change over time, so can still be there after 4, 5, 6 years post-injury. So we really need to have some meaningful engagement with people with lived experience of traumatic brain injury if our future interventions are more closely going to align to their needs. When I went back to my literature search, I was having a look at interventions that might be effective in the chronic phase of recovery for people following traumatic brain injury. And I found that group project work can improve communication skills and quality of life for people after brain injury, although none of the published studies explored have explored its use with families. So our plan was to work with people with lived experience of traumatic brain injury to co-design a family-based intervention that would be used with families. And because I've not used a co-design approach before, my research questions involved what was the impact of using a co-design approach in relation to the outcomes of my study in terms of developing a family project-based intervention, but also what about the experience of the people taking part? Any unintended consequences that might arise? And also, what barriers and facilitators might there be for people with cognitive communication difficulty after traumatic brain injury taking part in a co-design experience? So with recruitment, we were looking at 3 sites, NHS Lanarkshire, where I work, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and also an independent rehabilitation centre, Graham Anderson House. We were looking for people with cognitive communication difficulties at least 12 months following severe traumatic brain injury and also a family member. They had to have capacity to take part in research, but we also completed the San Diego brief assessment of capacity just to make sure that our participants understood what they were getting involved with and what it was and what it wasn't. We got ethics approval from West of Scotland REC, and that's our IRAS number there. So what did we do? We carried out a series of 4 online focus groups where the co-design team worked together to create the new intervention. We used a range of cognitive and communication supports at which we piloted and developed to support the process. And some of those were adapted talking mats using Google Jamboards in order to help people tell us what was important or not important about each aspect and ingredient. We also used accessible minutes afterwards so that people could access what it was we talked about, and accessible agendas to prepare our participants for what they were going to expect. We formed an advisory group of experienced clinicians and researchers, and they were to help us process the analysis of the data and think about what to do in future groups. All of the data from the groups were transcribed verbatim, and a thorough thematic analysis was completed. We also looked at co-design member experience using a survey pre and post to get quantitative data, and also questions within the focus group in order to get qualitative data. So our co-design team, we were really lucky and we managed to recruit 6 people following severe traumatic brain injury and 7 family members. We had quite a range of ages, from ages 18 to 67. And time since injury ranged from 2 to 12 years, and there was various relationship types: parent, partner, child, and sibling. And we were very lucky and we got good retention with people returning throughout the study to take part in the focus groups. So in terms of the results, discussing the concept of having a family therapy involving a project together resulted in 4 themes emerging, which encapsulated the co-design team's hopes and concerns about the therapy. Very much people thought it was a great idea to include family members, but they were a wee bit concerned that we might be building a wall without foundations. Foundations such as having a good level of brain injury education for all family members, making sure that everybody was emotionally ready to take part in a family group study together. The co-design participants also felt that sometimes after a brain injury, some time after a brain injury, people have gone off on different rail tracks and they aren't perhaps talking so much about the brain injury or the communication difficulties on the same page. So in order to introduce that, you might find that people are not all talking about the same thing, and the common ground is perhaps not there. The idea of big emotions arose, that beginning to talk about these things again within a family would cause big emotions to arise, and also people might be at different
Hello there, sorry, this is Catherine. Can anybody else hear me?
No, yes, the sound's gone.
Okay. Sorry, Lynn. No, I'm afraid not.
No. Has Darren left the session? Yeah. I wonder if we could, Lynn, I'm really sorry.
Can I suggest to try sometimes without the headset? Because that helped me yesterday.
Right.
No.
Darren, we've lost sound. I wonder if while we I'm conscious of how limited time we've got. I wonder if...
Who have you lost sound from?
Lynn.
I can end the meeting for you as well, so that should...
From who, sorry?
Lynn.
So I'll end this meeting and I'll see you in the session. Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Lynn. What? Hi, Lynn. You're muted at the moment.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm trying 5 for a day. Yes, okay.
Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Have you taken your headset off, the headset setting off, Lynn? There was a point where I was muted as well, Darren. I don't know what happened.
Lynn, if you can click on the cog button at the bottom of the screen and just make sure that that is set for your the sort of headset you're wearing. If it's kind of a USB headset or something like that, just make sure that's selected in the microphone setting.
It was working, Darren. It just suddenly stopped.
Right. Okay. I'd recommend, Lynn, if you just exit the meeting and join again, it will do the readiness checker to make sure that nothing's changed on your
Okay.
setting.
So if we move to Karen's presentation, and we'll pick Lynn's up on her return once Karen will run through your whole presentation, and then we'll come back to Lynn's if she successfully returns.
Can I ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because my headset didn't work with it either, which is why I haven't been wearing it. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think that is an issue.
It is. Catherine, could we ask you to share Karen's? Thank you. And Karen, if you take the 14 minutes to 3:35. Thank you. Okay.
So
thank you.
This was a 4-year study funded by the Nuffield Foundation that ran from 2018 to 2022. Next slide, please. The research team was multidisciplinary and included speech and language therapy, clinical psychology, occupational therapy, and the law. Next slide, please. This slide gives an overview of key features of the Mental Capacity Act that was published in 2005 and its accompanying code of practice. It covers England and Wales, and it's designed to protect and empower those who are deemed or assessed to lack capacity. The research provisions are different from all other provisions to do with care, treatment, and finance. So I'm going to go for, sorry, it's so small and I wanted to read out what is on the actual slide. This is not terribly helpful. Okay. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so, and the idea is that the Mental Capacity Act is designed to be sensitive to enhance vulnerability of people who lack capacity. But the research provisions use a consultee process rather than a best interest test for those who are deemed to lack capacity. And this involves using a personal or nominated consultee who offers an opinion about the willingness and likely wishes of the potential participant who lacks capacity. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what are the challenges of inclusive research in research that where the Mental Capacity Act is invoked? Well, firstly, it requires autonomous decision-making in the context of available information about the research project. Second, there are particular challenges for adults who may lack capacity and or have communication difficulties. And this includes adults with learning disabilities, autism, acquired brain injury, dementia, mental health conditions, and people with aphasia after stroke. There are ethical questions about whether it's appropriate to include such individuals in research in the first place. How do they benefit from participation? Fourth, do researchers run scared of including people who seem unable to give informed consent? And finally, if these individuals are excluded from research, what are the implications for the medical and social interventions that haven't been tried out with them? Next slide, please. So our aim was to develop evidence-based guidance for facilitating the inclusion of adults who may lack capacity and or have communication difficulties in ethically sound research. The figure on the right, which I know is very small, but it illustrates the development process through 2 phases. Phase 1 was about the establishment of the evidence from analysis of the ethico-legal landscape in England and Wales, and 2 was the survey of current research practice in England and Wales. The evidence informed the development and evaluation of prototypes 1 and 2 of the web-based guidance. Next slide, please. So what did we find from our evidence? Well, we found that in the research provisions, there is an imbalance between protection and empowerment, with a real emphasis on protection of the individuals concerned. We found there was very limited guidance in the Code of Practice or in the Health Research Authority resources that are available in their website. People who may lack capacity or have communication difficulties are often excluded from studies for those very reasons. And generally, we found a lack of understanding of the research provisions and insecurity as to how the legislation applied in research circumstances. Finally, we did find a range of recruitment materials were being used to support cognitive and communicative needs, but often researchers were defaulting to documentation, for example, an easy read participant information sheet. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we did was we developed a PowerPoint after we had synthesized all the evidence, just to capture key content. This was done collaboratively with our working group of people with lived experience, as well as an art group of autistic adults who created pictures for the guidance. We produced a narrative detailing the menu options and navigational problems.
Have we lost Karen? Oh. Oh no, I think that might be a connection. Carry on, Karen. Sorry, we lost you for a minute.
Okay. I'm turning off my video because I think that sometimes helps. Yes, is that
Okay.
all right?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
next
Thanks,
slide,
Karen.
please. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
fine. So, okay, so prototype 1, there was an introduction. The landing page outlined the purpose of the web-based guidance, and there were 3 main content domains: the law and ethics, capacity and decision-making, and adaptations and accommodations. We also had case scenarios embedded within those domains as examples. So the law and ethics, I won't go through all these things, but basically it focused on autonomous decision making and the issue of risk versus benefits in participation. The capacity and decision making looked at the principles of capacity, because obviously the individual is required to understand information, retain that information, weigh it up and consider the implications for themselves in terms of participation or non-participation, and also to communicate their decision. We also explained the role of consultee. Adaptations and accommodations was all about what can be put in place to support the individual capacity they had and to use their communication skills. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm rattling through this because I'm very aware of time. So we then entered a phase of iterative development, and we used 2 different ways of evaluating this. First, an online questionnaire was completed by participants post-review of the guidance, and secondly, a more focused review of the guidance was carried out through focus groups and individual interviews. The individual interviews were with people who had lived experience, and they had the option of having their supporter or a familiar person with them. They didn't all look at everything in these focus review, but they looked at slides from the various domains and were encouraged to talk about the content, the navigation, the presentation, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, oh gosh, this is very, very small on my screen. I don't know whether it can be made any bigger, but basically all I've got to say about this, these are the main results from the questionnaire. And basically, you know, generally the response was generally favorable, but for each of the closed questions that they responded to on the online questionnaire, they also had free field responses where they got to explain why they had rated the various aspects of the guidance in the way they had. Now these, we performed content analysis on this, and this informed the template that we applied to the focus group and the focus groups and to the individual interviews. Okay, but you can see they were generally okay, but when you dug deeper in the free field responses, there were some critical feedback that we needed to pay attention to. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide presents the results of the template analysis, where we used those themes that had already been derived and defined from the online questionnaire free field responses. Okay, and basically, oh gosh, the light is fading here. It's sort of lights out in Kenya at 6 o'clock. The feedback given by participants informed the prototype too. And you can see they said there was clear bullet pointing and clear headings, but they didn't like a lot of the pictures, and they wanted to reduce the pictures in size, and they didn't want the text to overlap. The navigation was a bit problematic. People struggled to progress their way through the slides, and it wasn't clear how far they'd come and where they needed to go next. They wanted us to reduce the amount of content, one thought or key concept per sentence. And the scenarios that were embedded in the domains were too much of a jump for people. We needed to have a separate section, they said. And they wanted some extra resources. And they said at the minimum, they needed a checklist that researchers could use that might help them in preparing their documentation for applying for ethical approval. Next slide, please. Okay, we can go past this slide because it's so small. This is prototype 2. Basically, it showed a change of colors and much clearer presentation. Okay, so this was, I don't know whether this is supposed to have some little arrows. It's not presented in the way it should be, but never mind, I'll try and talk it through. Basically, this shows the capacity and decision-making model that we had, showing 3 distinctive routes. So the first one was for those who had capacity but had no need for extra supports. So you will see that yellow arrow. They could just carry on and make their own autonomous decision. Then there was a group of people. Oh, the red is coming. That's good. So if you keep clicking, they'll all come in. So that's enough. That's great. Thank you. So the red route is for those people who may lack capacity, but we're not sure, but we need to put particular supports and adaptations in place in order for them to show and demonstrate their capacity for decision making and for them to have the right supports for their communication. But provided the right supports are in the place, they can make their own decision autonomously. The last route is the turquoise route, where after putting things in place, it's quite clear that individuals are not going to be able to make an autonomous decision. So they end up going, we end up seeking the opinion of the consultee. Next slide, please. Yeah, there you are, there's the routes. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this. Okay, so the results of prototype 2, we then did some usability testing, and it was very, very favorable. 90% found our bullet points and all our organizational devices very helpful. The animations that we did leave in were helpful. We had the sidebar of the updated version, they said was useful for tracking progress. The language was found to be much better. We couldn't get away with some volume of text. The scenarios they found, structuring the case scenarios around the principles of capacity, very helpful, and the extra resources also helpful. The big regret is we ran out of money and time to put a text to audio option. So that's a next thing to do. And we couldn't number the slides because there were so many embedded menus, it would have made things more complicated. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to cut. Okay, so if you want to access the Ascent guidance or to find any more about it, please look at our website, or please email me if you would like to take part in evaluating it, because the evaluation carries on, because obviously the iterative development carries on. So please email me at k.bunning@uea.ac.uk. Next slide, please. These are some of the peer-reviewed publications having come out of this research. We've been very busy with our work. Next slide, please. just to acknowledge these various groups that we worked with very helpfully. And the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and quite a feat doing that remotely from Kenya. So that's brilliant, and hopefully the light will hold until we get to the Q&A part of the session. So thank you so much. Lynn, are you able to pick up your last 5 minutes of your presentation?
Yep, I can have a
Yep.
go, or does the other speaker want to go, and then if there's time left, what do you think? Are you happy for me to keep going?
Yep, we're getting a nod from Melanie. So if you want to finish your
Right.
presentation, and just because of the administrative difficulties, we might chip into the Q&A time a little bit, so all
Right,
three of
okay.
you get the 14 minutes. So fire away, Lynn. Thank
I'll
you.
try and share my slides and not lose my voice. Can you see that okay?
Yes, lovely.
Great
Thank you.
stuff. All right then. So in terms of how we translated those themes into targets and ingredients, I've not got all of them here, but example targets were that the co-design participants were keen to have a joint family narrative by the end of the intervention, that they would all be on the same page in terms of talking about the cognitive communication difficulties. And also that there would be a permanent toolbox of cognitive communication supports that all members of the family and the person with brain injury could dip into and look at over time, even after the intervention had finished. Essential ingredients included a video of project therapy, what it is and how it works, real life examples and explanations throughout all of the tasks that we would be doing, and also to make sure that we made support for emotional adjustment explicit within the intervention. So in terms of the impact on the people that took part in the study, I've just got a qualitative quote here, and this was a family member talking about their loved one with brain injury, and they've just said, seeing his eagerness to get involved and have his voice heard, I was like, this is amazing. So in terms of the pre-study questionnaire, we asked people why they wanted to get involved in doing some co-design with us. And over 90% of respondents said they were keen to turn a negative experience into a positive. And they wanted to give something back and make a difference. The things that were less important to the co-design team members were things like learning about research and that sort of thing. After the study, when we asked, what was the experience like, 100% of respondents said they would consider getting involved in future research, so we hadn't put them off, which was good, that they'd felt listened to and respected, and actually they were also happy with the confidentiality and the privacy aspects. A couple of the things that perhaps didn't get 100% was understanding their role within the co-design project, and also being aware of what their input had added in terms of what quality was added by their input. So in terms of barriers of doing co-design with people with cognitive communication difficulties and their family members, the online nature of the group did prove difficult for some people. Participants, family members and people with cognitive communication difficulties both had difficulty understanding the role of why they were there at times, and also the concept of what project-based intervention was. It was quite, everybody came with their own expectations and ideas of what we would discuss, so sometimes it was quite difficult to manage diverse expectations. And also I think I learned from experience I was a much better co-design facilitator at the end than I was at the beginning. I think it's really important to ensure the process is participant-led and that the outcome is from the co-design group and not a tick box exercise. I think at the beginning I went in with ideas of questions that I wanted to ask and constructs to measure, but actually it became very clear within groups 2 and 3 and 4 that people could generate those ideas themselves. And lack of budget, because it was a PhD study, there was no budget, so we were limited at only doing 4 groups. And I think the feedback from a lot of the co-design team members was it would have been very good if they could have come for quite a bit longer, but it wouldn't have been fair because we had no way to, recompense them. In terms of facilitators, it really helped if I was giving people extra support and practice to get online, sending them text beforehand, using a phone to help them talk through the steps of getting onto Microsoft Teams. Building in extra time to recap the role and the concept of project-based intervention was really helpful, not just at the beginning of each of the groups, but actually regularly throughout the groups, so that everybody was still on the same page and we were aware of what we were working on together. It was really important to ensure all voices were heard, and what we found was that some of our participants that had cognitive communication difficulties struggled with groups of 4 people. So what we had to do is adapt and do some extra groups with just 2 people involved and have some extra supports for them. What was also interesting was people from the same family were keen to be in different groups so that they could speak plainly, and they actually all got a lot of benefit from meeting other people with brain injury and other family members, and it really helped ideas to develop rather than people getting stuck on perhaps previous ideas and conflicts. I can't stress enough, you need to spend lots of time developing and piloting your communication support tools, perhaps with other people that you're working with in clinic. That was really, really helpful. And I think having experience of working with brain injury and being flexible was also really a good facilitator. Being able to analyse the data after each group instead of waiting to the end was necessary so that we could help ideas to develop. And also having the advisory group there to help us develop those ideas and think about what to move on with next. So in terms of unintended consequences, it took a lot longer than expected. We did more groups with smaller numbers. We needed to do more training on the role and the purpose. And some of the changes that the co-design members came up with were fantastic, but they were quite macro changes, which meant that I had to go back and do quite a lot of adaptation to the intervention, which is great, but it took definitely more time. We had to really think about group mix to make sure that all voices were heard. And also, I loved this process. This was supposed to be a stepping stone towards the next part in the PhD, but actually, I thought I'd arrived. I loved this bit, and I think we should do lots more co-design. And then just a quick summary. So although it was really labour intensive, we got a really rich source of data, and it was a positive experience for the co-design team members. Our next step is to try out the new co-design therapy with a small group of families to see if it's feasible. And those are my references, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Lynn, and it's great that we were able to get you back to complete that really interesting presentation too. So we're starting to get some questions in the comments and in the Q&A, so we'll address those at the end of Melanie's session. So Melanie, you've got 14 minutes, so away you go. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to share some of the research that we've been doing. And I think this topic of inclusion in co-design is so close to my heart, and I'm very excited to be able to share some of the insights from my PhD research. So today I thought I would spend a bit of time talking about a scoping review that I did in collaboration with other researchers. And we were looking at studies that had included underrepresented speech and language therapists as research participants. So very much looking at who has been included and who may have been, whose voice are missing. Also looking at geographic distribution, so from which context is this research being done, and also the research processes and the methods that have been implemented to facilitate the amplification of the voices of underrepresented SLTs as research participants. So as we were actually looking at underrepresented SLTs, in the research, I've been extremely lucky and honored to be working with other underrepresented SLTs who have very much contributed to such a great extent to the design and the delivery of this study. So a big thank you, even though I'm presenting today, but it's very much on behalf of this amazing team. And I really want to thank Katie, Fatima, and Voon, who have contributed very much to this study, and also my PhD supervisors, Napoleon Katsos and Jenny Gibson. And another big acknowledgement, and I really wanted to make a point today about that, I want to acknowledge the RCSLT because I received a minor grant for this scoping review, and that has allowed me to pay the other researchers to really value their inputs in the study and value their expertise and their time. And I think sometimes when we think about co-design, a lot of it sometimes is not paid, and actually that can be very counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve, and that can further marginalize some voices that are not able to contribute because they may not have the capacity and the time to engage in those free activities. So yeah, really wanted to make a point on that for this topic today. All right, so in terms of background, during this conference, it's been amazing to see how much more we're talking about issues of inclusion and diversity. But just to reiterate some of those messages. So the speech language therapy profession, as we know, has been established and very much built and shaped around the voices of actually quite a small and very homogeneous demographic. And here we can think about considerations of geographic location. So a lot of Western contexts have really it's where the profession is being built from those contexts and is being then exported to other contexts, but also thinking about different dimensions of human diversity. And here, it's not just, for example, if we think of gender, we know that there's lots of females compared to males in the profession, but it's actually not on just one dimension that we're not very diverse. It's on so many, and it's that one intersectional identity that is very much overrepresented in the profession. And that means that we may not be representative of the communities that we're providing services for. And at the end of the day, that can really widen gaps because we may not be providing the best services for the communities that we're serving. So luckily, as I said, there's been lots of talks around these issues in the conferences, and there's lots of recognition of those issues. We're seeing lots of good initiatives. It's not just talks. We're starting to see lots of action as well, which is very encouraging around issues of, for example, in recruitment processes to access the speech language therapy courses at university, but also the development of cultural competence frameworks, very much trying to include the voices and co-designing those frameworks with minority groups. And I also wanted to thank the RCSLT because in their RCSLT strategic vision, they highlight how we need to include the voices of minority groups, but not just to be part of the conversation, but actually in leadership roles and giving the capacity to make decisions that really can lead to transformation in the profession. So this is important. Now, I've talked a little bit about the policy landscape and about some clinical settings, but I want to go back now to the role of researchers and the role of research and how we can really have an incredible role to play to transform the profession by reflecting on the research practices that we use. And actually including underrepresented members of our communities can be a very effective and empowering mechanism to stimulate change. And what that means is that by including diverse voices, we start to shape the narrative in research. We're starting to include perhaps different priorities that have been deprioritized before, and creating this evidence base that is then going to shape and inform tomorrow's practices. So there's a real great potential for transformation through including underrepresented SLTs. Now, there's loads of really, I'm not saying anything new here. There's really lots of good practices that we see in SLT research. And for example, I've been incredibly inspired by the work of Professor Sharon McLeod and Professor Julie Marshall, and how they've allowed to decenter the medical model in speech-language therapy scholarship and recenter new frameworks such as the human rights frameworks or the UN agenda frameworks. So, you know, thinking about conceptual frameworks that we center in research. Also, there's lots more research in speech and language therapy using critical race theories or feminist theories, and even the methods that we use and the methodological frameworks can really shape the evidence that we're producing. So there's lots of great innovation. Now, our team, what we want to bring to this picture is the transformative research paradigm. And that's a research paradigm that is very much acknowledging that the production of knowledge and research as a process is not neutral, but is a dynamic process that fundamentally engages with issues of social justice and power imbalances. And it's trying to, in all the epistemological, ontological, and methodological principles, to recenter social justice. And one of the key tenets of this research paradigm is very much to engage with the marginalized members of our communities in ways that really recenter their voices, value the knowledge that they have, and they can contribute and try to address some of those power inequities. So to the best of our knowledge, this research paradigm has not been introduced in speech language therapy scholarship. So yeah, very happy to answer any questions if you're not familiar with this. But yeah, it's under this research paradigm that we're positioning our scoping review. And we try to, through this lens, look at the studies that have already been published, studies that have included marginalized members of our communities as research participants. So we have 3 research questions, but I won't have time to go through everything. And I'm just going to give you a snapshot of research question number 1 and research question number 3 around some of the key characteristics of those studies and the extent to which those studies aligned with the principles of transformative research. Now, we followed the scoping review framework that was developed by Oxy and O'Malley, and you can see the different steps on the slide. So identify the research questions, identify the relevant studies, the study selection, charting the data, and then summarizing and reporting the results. Now, in this framework, there's this optional 6th step, which is the consultation. Well, for us, it wasn't very optional, and we actually included this throughout all the different steps, throughout the entire design and implementation of the study. And what was really important is that we also facilitated lots of co-production. So for example, we published the protocol of the study and engaged with underrepresented SLTs to inform, even before we conducted the search, to inform our direction. And we also included lots of reflexive research practices in the process. So for example, when we extracted data and started to analyze the data from the studies, we had a whole section where we were reflecting on our own privilege, our own positionality, and that was very much part of the knowledge creation process. So really, really important. All right, so in terms of results, we searched 6 databases and the Cochrane library. We ended up with almost 17,000 results, but in the end included only 20 papers. All right, just a few information about the findings in terms of the characteristics of the studies. So you can see on the slide, there's a map. And not surprisingly at all, there's a lot of the research is coming from the US and other Western contexts, such as the UK and Canada. There was just South Africa that I want to highlight. We had one study on male speech and language therapists, and that's the only low middle income country that we included, or where the study was based. So in terms of the characteristics of the participants themselves, which groups have been included? Well, the majority, the biggest group were the bilingual speech and language therapists, followed by this mixed group that was often a mix of the researchers looking and reporting on social economic status, cultural background, ethnicity, and linguistic. And it was this kind of broad group with lots of different considerations, but not really detailing what they were really looking at. So identifying that as minority speech language therapists. And male SLTs as well were quite present. And in terms of the type of studies, so there were lots of investigations of SLT service delivery or training that actually didn't include just underrepresented SLTs, but were disaggregating data from, for example, monolingual and bilingual SLTs, and trying to look at how they may have responded differently to a survey, for example. All right, and now to another aspect of the research that we did is we didn't just want to look at, what were those studies doing and which groups were included and everything. We also wanted to see to what extent the researchers were aligning with the principles of transformative research. So we followed a checklist that was developed by Sweetman et al. 2010. And so it's 10 questions. They're quite simple. There's actually a bit of limitation because sometimes it's almost too simple in the way that they're phrased, and you do need to go into more details. But what it allows us to do this mapping exercise. And here I want to acknowledge that, the researchers may not have set to be positioned with the transformative research paradigm. So it's not a question of, oh, you didn't do this job very well. It's just identifying practices in speech language therapy that may have actually really empowered the participants, and identifying gaps, so opportunities to perhaps do better in future studies. All right, and this is the results that we find in terms of the criteria that were actually really well followed by the researchers of those studies, and those that perhaps were missing. So I highlighted in blue, I don't know if it's quite visible on the slides, but I highlighted in blue the three best scoring criteria, let's say, and in orange, those that were not very well represented in the literature. So the three that were really good were that lots of authors actually openly referenced a problem in the community of concern. And the results facilitated change, and here it was very often actually quite indirectly through the development of recommendations. So it wasn't always evaluated, but there was this intent to move into action. And very importantly, quite a lot of studies also showed how the researchers elucidated power relationships. So for example, including concepts around how their positionality with regards to the participants could have influenced the results. And these are very important reflections. In terms of the criteria that didn't score so well, the authors very rarely discussed labeling of the participants. And this is very important because words have a lot of weight. And if we use language that is not, that people with which we're working with do not associate it with, then it can be very disempowering. So perhaps the researchers had those thoughts and had those considerations, and it wasn't reflected in the paper. That's a possibility, but it's something to really keep in mind when we're doing research with underrepresented groups. Another consideration, so a lot of studies, actually no study, had the participants initiate the research. In just a few studies, you could see how they may have helped with the design of the study. For example, if you start with a survey, and then from the results of the survey, you inform the interview. So the insights of the participants really helped shape some of the project, but it was very few of those studies that included those considerations. And sorry, I actually can't see my slides because I have a notification about the platform. I can't remember the last one. Oh yeah, about the if the authors openly reference the transformative research. Again, that wasn't done in a lot of studies. All right, I'm coming to the end. So just two big keywords if you had anything to take away from this presentation. So this review highlighted the voices that are currently being included in research when we think about underrepresented SLTs, but it also highlighted those that are missing. And whilst it's encouraging to see that bilingual SLTs are being given this platform to shape the evidence in SLT scholarship, other groups are really missing, such as speech language therapists with disabilities. There were very few. LGBTQIA+. I was very happy to see the platform of the conference to hear those voices and see more research being done, but we didn't have any studies with them in our review. The lack of geographic diversity in SLT research is also something to consider when we think about the representation of research and the way that knowledge is being created in our profession. And finally, intersectional identities were very rarely considered. So that's something that we really need to keep a close eye on, because intersectionality is very fundamental and can fundamentally shape our needs. So that's the first message. And then the second is how the transformative research paradigm can really make us rethink how and why we do research. And I think, yeah, if there's something that I want you to take away from this presentation, is how the role of researchers and participants and the collaboration between the two can be a very powerful collaboration, very much engaging with those issues of power imbalances and social justice. And yeah, the transformative checklist was actually a very useful tool to start thinking about those considerations in research. Finally, here are a few quotes from the co-researchers. And yeah, really wanted to bring their voices into the presentation, even though they were not able to be here today. But very much reflecting on how being part of this research has been an empowering mechanism for them, as well as building their capacity in research in a way that really valued their lived experiences, and that just in itself was very powerful for them. And I'm going to stop here, but just to say that we had this study available as a preprint, and here's the QR code. And I'll be very happy to also share the link in the chat and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to all our presenters for some really fabulous presentations. So we have got a few minutes for questions and comments, and there's been quite a lot of comments going on in the chat. So Karen, just checking, can you hear and respond for this section of the session?
Yes, can you hear me?
Lovely. Yes, we can hear you, thank you. So in terms of the questions, we had our first question from Izzy, who asks, and I think it might be directed a little bit at you, Lynn, but she was really interested around the co-design and support for funding for people who become involved in research. I know that I think Catherine had put a section in, but I wonder if that's a question you want to address in terms of your research?
Yep, so support for funding for co-design would be great, wouldn't it? And I think up in Scotland we don't, we're not really able to get any of the NIHR grants, which is often very good, and co-design so important for them. But certainly there was no budget available for the co-design part of my study.
That's a shame, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I suppose it depends a little bit around recruitment as well. If you recruit through organisations, some organisations have support for involvement, but it needs to be prioritised in more detail. And I haven't had time to follow Catherine's link, but that might be worth pursuing. Karen, there was a detailed conversation going on between yourself and Nicola around the legislation to do with research involvement in relation to that and other areas involvement. I don't know if that's something you're in a position to just kind of summarise briefly that discussion for the participants.
Well, if Nicola comes in and helps out, I think the main thing is the research provisions. What people don't really understand is that when we did the legal analysis and we looked at all the Hansard debates that had led up to the publishing of this act, the research provisions were an afterthought, which was kind of interesting. We were quite shocked when we found that out. It was just some baroness suddenly said, "Oh, what do we do about research?" "Oh," said someone else, "we better do something." So it's poorly drafted and poorly thought through. So, it is very, very constraining, in fact, on involving people who perhaps are assessed to lack capacity. They are at the moment revising the code of practice, and we did contribute to that consultation, but whether in fact it will produce as much of the practical guidance as we need, I don't know. And certainly my colleagues in other disciplines in the university that I work at, they still continue to exclude people from participation if they have any kind of capacity difficulty, or there's questions about it, or a communication difficulty, because it's much harder work. And the Research Ethics Committee members are really anxious about whether we should be including these people. This is what I meant when I said early on about protection being emphasized over empowerment. And it's a problem. And it's also a problem because the Research Ethics Committee members are very insecure about what the law allows. And when people are insecure, they tend to default to protecting. So, it's a big problem.
Thanks, Karen. And I think it's when you really start to think about it, it's unethical not to include them, isn't it? I mean, why would we exclude people for those reasons? So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm also, in terms of Melanie's presentation, Melanie, you'll see from the chat that there's a lot of interest in this, and some real interest in kind of that neurodiversity component as well. And actually, Karen saying, how do we address these going forward? So any thoughts, Karen? I can see you coming in the dark from Kenya now, so lucky you. It's very different here in the UK. But I wonder, Melanie, about your thoughts moving forward, and just to acknowledge you've really inspired people to go away and think, all three of you. So once we've responded to that, I think we'll have to close the session and ask the participants to pick up with the presenters outside of the session. Melanie, any closing thoughts about how we develop this?
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And it was actually, we didn't have any studies that included the voices of neurodivergent people. And there were 2 studies, if you look at a bit bigger, the bigger umbrella of SLTs with disabilities. We had one study, I think it was with someone with a hearing aid, so hearing impairment, and another one about SLT students who stammer. So these were the other 2. And there's huge gaps in the literature. And I know that the RCSLT is actually doing a lot of work in the background. I don't know if it's visible yet, but I know a lot of people are very busy. There's been a survey that has been distributed to identify the experiences of SLTs with disabilities. But we really need to do that and upscale that, I think, especially in the research world, and to really think and take the time to think about the right methodologies that we use to really empower people to participate and meaningfully engage throughout the research processes at every single step, not just one. So yeah, I think that will be my contribution. I don't know if I really answered the question, but very happy to take that off stage. Yeah.
Thank you, Melanie. And I think, yeah, that the methodologies is a really important point, isn't it? I'm conscious of the time and I don't want people to run out of time, so I'm going to close the session now. Thank you so much to Melanie, to Lynn and to Karen, and I know Nicola was here in support too. So thank you so much for a really interesting session. It's been a pleasure to chair, and I hope you've all enjoyed the session. I can see from the comments that you're getting a resounding support, and at the height there was 41 participants